Today I'm going to teach you how to make a cheater quilt. It's a quilt you can finish in about 2 hours from start to finish. Please like this video and follow my channel. So a cheater quilt is a quilt that you don't actually piece the fabrics together. You buy fabric that looks like a quilt and then you quilt it to look like a quilt. So this is the fabric I'm going to use. This is a fabric I bought off of Spoonflower, and it's kind of a Harry Potter inspired fabric, Gryffindor, and it has a bunch of different blocks. When you make a cheater quilt, you don't actually need to buy something like this that looks like a quilt with the pieces put together. You can also use striped fabric, you can use plaid fabric. Essentially, you can use any fabric that has lines or grids that you can use to do your quilting. And once you do your quilting, it will make it look like a quilt. So what you'll need for a cheater quilt is you have to decide what size you're going to do. I'm going to be making a throw size quilt. So I have this fabric, it's quilting weight fabric, and it's 42 inches wide by 2 yards long. You'll also need the same amount of fabric for the back of the quilt. You can use quilting cotton or flannel. This is the fabric I had in my stash that actually matches the Harry Potter fabric really well. It's not a Gryffindor color, but it's kind of that gold and gray, and I think it works really well with the quilt. I'm choosing to use flannel because it's warmer. You can use quilting cotton because it's a lighter weight and it won't make the quilt as warm. You will also need some quilt batting. I chose to get warm and natural. I wanted a cotton just because I like cotton. I got a twin size quilt because I'm going to be making 2 cheater quilts, and I can cut this in half for 2 throw sizes, and it's perfect. I have to buy 1 instead of 2. It's a little cheaper doing that. Lastly, you need bias binding for the edge. You can also make it. You can make it from the backing fabric so that it matches the back, or you can make it from a different fabric so it's a nice coordinating or bright color. It's up to you and what you want for your quilt.
The first thing you want to do is to prepare your fabric. Do not pre-wash any of the fabrics. Trim any selvages or white space off of the quilt top fabric. The Spoonflower fabric comes printed, but there's white borders all the way around, so that's what I'm trimming off. The next thing you're going to do is layer your fabrics. Put your backing fabric down first, right side down. Make sure it's flat with no wrinkles. Then lay your batting on top of it and make sure it's flat with no wrinkles. Make sure it's centered with the fabric underneath, and then put your quilt top on top of that. Make sure it's centered and there are no wrinkles. Then safety pin all across the quilt top so all layers are safety pinned together. I used about 15 to 20 safety pins. Now you're going to quilt the 3 fabrics together by sewing a straight line along the grid of your fabric. If you're using stripes or plaid or blocks like this, I'm just following a straight line and sewing all the way from one side to another side. I started by quilting from side to side. I started at the top and quilted each line until I got to the halfway mark, and then I started again at the bottom and quilted until I got to the middle and met where I had already quilted. I used a quilting foot to make it easier and keep all the fabrics together without any shifting or tucks being created. It might look like I'm pulling the fabric, but I'm actually just guiding it and letting the foot do the work. It's just the fabric is bulky and heavy, and so I'm making sure that it's being guided through the machine and not getting stuck in my lap or hanging over the table. After quilting from side to side, I started at the top and went down, and I started on one side and went into the middle until I came to the halfway point, and then started on the other side and started from the bottom and went to the top until I met the quilting that had already been done in the middle. Now that all the quilting has been done, you need to trim the edges and the batting. Anything that is larger than the quilt top, you need to trim off. This is kind of like truing your quilt and making sure it's all the same size and that your corners are right angles. I like to have rounded corners on my quilt. It's just a personal preference, and for me it's easier to put bias binding on the edge. So I lay my plate down and I cut around with scissors so I can get a nice curved corner. The last thing you need to do on your quilt is to finish the edges with bias binding. Now you can use pre-made bias binding, which I think is the easiest and the fastest since it's already prepared. You just fold it around the edges and clip it on and then sew it on. You can also make your own bias binding, which takes longer but has a unique look and can coordinate with your quilt top better. Now you can sew your bias binding onto the edge of your quilt. I like to put my blind hem foot into my machine and use that as a guide since I think it makes a really nice clean finish. If you are really good at quilting, you can choose to hand sew your bias binding on for an even better look. When I get to a corner, I pull the bias binding a little bit to make it tighter, and then I go around the corner. And that's how you get a really nice corner when doing bias binding. You need to stretch it as you sew. You will sew much faster when doing the bias binding if you use clips and clip it on all the way around the quilt so that you're not always adjusting and fixing like I was. When you get back to where you started, I like to take the quilt and bias binding out of the foot and sew a little seam in the bias binding to have a seamless look. You can also clip the pre-made bias binding on your quilt to make it faster to sew. And I also use my blind hem foot when I'm using pre-made bias binding to get a really nice, perfectly top stitched edge. Now, wash your quilt the way you would normally wash it, either hot or warm, and then dry it in the dryer to get all the fabrics to shrink and look like a perfectly soft quilt.
This quilt is a fantastic gift. It's really fun to give. The great thing about a faux quilt is that it's really easy to make. It comes together really fast, but it looks like you made this intricate, beautiful quilt.
Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see all the cheater quilts you make.